My grandmother was always a constant presence in my life, the kind of person who seemed to know everything about everyone and who held an unwavering affection for me. I grew up under her care, listening to stories about the hard times she faced, her life lessons, and the homemade remedies she always prepared to cure any ailment. When she passed away, it felt like a part of me had disappeared forever. I was by her side during her last days, and even as her body weakened, the sparkle in her eyes never faded. After the funeral, there came a moment when the entire family gathered for the reading of the will. It was a tense meeting, everyone grieving and at the same time eager to understand what she had left to each of us. The lawyer entered the room with a sealed envelope and a professional expression. We sat in silence as he began to read the provisions. For each family member, my grandmother had left something meaningful: jewelry, emotionally valuable items, parts of the house where we grew up. But when it came to my turn, the lawyer paused. He took a small wooden box out of a bag and placed it in my hands. "Your grandmother left this for you with clear instructions. You are only to open this box 1 year after her death." I looked at the box, bewildered. It was a beautiful piece with delicate carvings, but it felt heavy. The mystery of what could be inside immediately gripped me, and a mix of curiosity and frustration took hold. Why wait a year? Why not open it now? That night, I drove home with the box beside me on the passenger seat. Throughout the drive, I couldn't take my eyes off it, imagining what it might contain. My grandmother was not the type of person who did things without a reason. Everything she did had a clear purpose. But what was her intention in making me wait so long? Upon arriving home, I placed the box in a safe place. I felt a mix of reverence and frustration as I looked at it. I didn't dare force it open, even though part of me desperately wanted to uncover the secret hidden inside. Instead, I chose to wait and honor my grandmother's wish, no matter how difficult it was. Throughout the year following my grandmother's death, the box became a constant, and in some ways unsettling presence in my life. I kept it in a corner of my room, covered with a cloth so it wouldn't be in plain sight. But even then, it felt as though it was watching me, always reminding me that something important was there, waiting to be discovered. I tried to move on with my life. Mourning my grandmother's loss was a slow and painful process, and the days seemed to pass in a haze. I worked, saw friends, and carried on with my routine, but in quiet moments, my mind always drifted back to the box. What could be so significant that it had to remain hidden for so long? I asked myself over and over. On some nights, when the silence of the house felt particularly heavy, I would sit beside the box and recall the stories my grandmother used to tell. She often spoke of her youth as a time of challenges and changes, but there were details she avoided sharing. I thought of the few times she grew introspective, gazing at old photos and sighing in a melancholic way, as if there was something she preferred to forget or keep to herself. One of those photos caught my attention as I sorted through her belongings months after the funeral. It was an image of my grandmother, very young, standing next to a man I had never seen before. There was something in her eyes, a gleam of happiness, a smile that seemed truly fulfilled. I asked my father about the man in the photo, but he just shook his head, not recognizing him. No one in the family seemed to know. These small discoveries began to unsettle me. With each new detail I uncovered, the feeling grew stronger that there was a part of my grandmother's life I knew nothing about. I remember one afternoon when I almost opened the box. I was alone, curiosity burning in my mind like a fever. I picked up a key that seemed to fit the lock and held my breath. But at the last moment I stopped. The desire to honor her request outweighed my urge to satisfy my curiosity. And so the year passed, a blend of memories and questions. I revisited places that held meaning for both of us. The park where we used to walk, the bakery where she bought my favorite bread. Each place brought back a vivid memory, and, in some way, helped me bear her absence. In the last month of that year, the box seemed heavier than ever. The time for waiting was almost over, and I knew that when I finally opened it, my life might never be the same. The only thing I could do was prepare myself for whatever lay ahead. The year finally came to an end, bringing with it a sense of relief and anticipation. The curiosity that had consumed me all these months was about to be satisfied. On the exact day marking 1 year since my grandmother's passing, I sat in my living room, the wooden box on the table before me. The room was quiet, except for the sound of my breathing, which seemed louder than usual. Carefully, I removed the cloth covering the box and ran my hand over the carvings, feeling every detail that made it so special. I took a deep breath and held the key I had kept for so long. I inserted it into the lock and turned it slowly, hearing a soft click. The lid opened, revealing a letter, an old diary, and some faded photographs. The letter was on top, with my name written in handwriting I immediately recognized. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the letter and began to read. Dear, I know this moment must be filled with questions. I hope that, by opening this box, you will find the answers I never had the courage to give you in life. There are secrets I've carried for a long time, and I feel now is the time for you to know them. The diary you will find here tells the story of the true love of my life. The man whom, unfortunately, you never met. He is, in fact, your real grandfather. The truth about your lineage is something I kept in my heart. But now I want you to know it, as it belongs to you too. My heart raced as I read those words. My grandmother was telling me that the man I had always known as my grandfather was not, in fact, my mother's real father. A wave of shock hit me, and I had to pause for a moment to process what I had just read. The questions flooding my mind were so many that it was hard to focus on just one. Who was this man? And why had she never spoken about him? I picked up the diary and began to leaf through it. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, and the first words took me back to a past I didn't know. My grandmother described her early youth, how she met a man named Miguel. They fell deeply in love, and she wrote about him with a passion I had never seen in the stories she told in life. With each page, it was as if I was getting to know a new version of my grandmother, a young woman full of dreams, living a forbidden love. Midway through the diary, I began to understand why she had kept this secret for so long. Miguel was not accepted by my grandmother's family. They were from different worlds, and the social pressures of the time caused the two to be separated. My grandmother ended up marrying a man her family approved of, the man I knew as my grandfather, but her heart had always belonged to Miguel. They met in secret for a brief period, and it was from this union that my mother was born. There was something profoundly moving, yet sad, about the way my grandmother described her choice. A choice that wasn't truly hers but was imposed upon her. The diary was filled with regret, but also with love. She wanted me to know that, despite life's mistakes and impositions, that true love had existed, and from it came a new generation. Me. I finished reading the diary with tears in my eyes. It was as if, for a moment, my grandmother had returned to tell me one last story, her true story, and now the weight of the box made sense. Inside it, there were not only secrets but also the legacy of a love that transcended time. I spent the following days immersed in the diary, unable to stop reading the story my grandmother had written. It felt as if each page revealed a new and thrilling piece of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. She began with her youth, describing how she met Miguel at a festival in the small town where she lived. He was an outsider who had come from afar to work on a construction project, and his different, free-spirited nature, full of ideas she had never heard before, made her fall in love with him immediately. Their love story was intense and filled with obstacles. They met in secret, exchanged letters, and planned a future that never came to be. My grandmother's family discovered the romance and did everything they could to separate them. She was sent away and forced to cut off contact with Miguel. The diary described her broken heart, the despair of being separated from the man she loved, and the constant pressure to follow a path deemed more suitable by her family. When she returned, Miguel was no longer there. But there was one final meeting, and it was from that moment, stolen from a life they could never share, that my mother was born. My grandmother wrote about her hope that, somehow, Miguel would return, that he would learn about the daughter they had together. But fate seemed to have other plans, and soon she found herself married to the man I knew as my grandfather. A good man, but one who never filled the place Miguel held in her heart. As I read about my mother's birth, I could sense the hidden pain in my grandmother's words. She loved my mother, but living under the weight of such a great secret was a constant burden. She feared that if the truth came out, it could destroy the family she had built and bring suffering to everyone. So she chose silence, and every decision afterward was marked by that unspoken truth. There were also mentions of Miguel's attempts to reach out. My grandmother mentioned receiving a letter from him years later, saying he still wanted to see her and perhaps learn about their daughter. But my grandmother didn't have the courage to respond. The fear of reopening old wounds and the possibility of losing the little stability she had managed to achieve kept her silent. It was a choice she clearly regretted until the end of her days, but one she believed was the only option at the time. The diary revealed not only the love she had for Miguel, but also the regret and longing she carried throughout her life. Each line written was a reminder of a love that was never fully lived, a promise that time and circumstances never allowed them to fulfill. I could feel the weight of her words, and a deep sadness began to grow within me. For her, for Miguel, and for the story I never got to hear directly from her lips. When I closed the diary, there was one thing I knew for certain. I needed to find more answers. I needed to understand who Miguel was, where he had been, and whether there was more I could discover about the life my grandmother wasn't able to live. She had left me this diary not only to tell the truth but perhaps also to encourage me to do what she couldn't, to find the rest of the story. With the diary in hand, I felt that the mission of discovering who Miguel was and what his story entailed now belonged to me. It was as if my grandmother had passed on the responsibility to complete what she had started and, due to fear and life circumstances, could not finish. So I decided to begin my search. The first stop was my grandmother's old house. The house had been sold, but I still had access before the new owners moved in. As I walked through the empty rooms, it felt like her spirit was still there, watching, guiding my steps. I opened the old wardrobe in her bedroom, the one that always seemed to hold secrets. In one of the drawers, I found a wooden box, not much different from the one she had left me. Inside were old documents and some photos I didn't recognize. Among them, I saw a portrait of Miguel, older, holding a letter in his hands. It seemed he had made another attempt to reach out, perhaps hopeful that this time she would respond. Besides the photo, there was an address. The paper was yellowed with age, and the address pointed to a place in a nearby town. I wasted no time. I knew I needed to go there. My heart was pounding as I drove toward that place. I didn't know what I would find, but the desire to know more was greater than any apprehension. Arriving in the town, I discovered the address was for a simple house on a quiet street. I knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered, whom I soon recognized as an old friend of my grandmother. When I mentioned my grandmother's name and Miguel's, her eyes lit up with surprise and nostalgia. "You must be her grandson," the woman said, inviting me in. We sat in the living room, surrounded by old photographs and furniture that seemed to have their own stories. The woman, whose name was Antonia, began to talk about her friendship with my grandmother and how she always knew about the love between her and Miguel. "They were meant for each other," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's a shame that circumstances didn't allow them to be together." Antonia revealed something I hadn't expected. Miguel had tried to reunite with my grandmother several times. He even knew about my mother and wanted to meet her. One of his attempts to reach out happened when I was still a child. Miguel came to the town, tried to speak with my grandmother, but was stopped by the family. She explained that my grandmother's parents, fearing the social and emotional impact of a reunion, told Miguel that he was not welcome and that moving on was his only choice. Each word from Antonia brought a new layer of pain and regret to the surface. The thought that my true grandfather had been so close and that I had never known was hard to accept. Antonia handed me another letter, one that Miguel had left before leaving for good. My hands trembled as I held the yellowed paper, and my heart tightened as I read the words of a man who had never stopped loving. In the letter, Miguel spoke of his love for my grandmother and his desire to meet his daughter. There was a deep sadness in his words, but also an acceptance that fate had chosen a different path for them. The letter ended with a message of hope, that perhaps one day, somehow, future generations could learn the truth and understand that that love was never forgotten. With that letter, I felt I was finally starting to piece together the puzzle. Not only had I discovered who Miguel was, but I also understood the depth of the love he and my grandmother shared. A love that transcended the obstacles imposed by others. And, in a way, I felt that now I carried a part of that love with me, as a legacy that could not be left behind. With all the information I had uncovered, I returned home determined to face the reality of what my family had hidden for so long. It wasn't just the story of my grandmother and Miguel. It was also the story of all of us. There was a sense of urgency, a need to bring everything to light, so that the burden of that secret wouldn't carry on to future generations. The silence about the past had already done enough damage. I gathered my family in the living room of my parents' house. My uncles, my mother, everyone was there. I could feel the tension in the air, as if everyone knew that something important was about to be discussed. I approached the table and placed my grandmother's diary and Miguel's letter on it. My mother, in particular, looked apprehensive. I had never seen her so anxious. She looked at the diary, and even before I said anything, tears began to form in her eyes. "Why did you hide this from me?" I asked, my voice steady but laden with an emotion I was trying to control. "Why did you never tell me the truth about my real grandfather?" My mother took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an easy choice, my son. Your grandmother suffered a lot, and we thought we were protecting everyone. We wanted to avoid more pain, to keep old ghosts from coming back to haunt us. It was what we were taught." A heavy silence fell over the room. My uncles also bowed their heads, and I realized that some of them knew, while others seemed as surprised as I was. The explanations came slowly: fear of others' judgment, fear that the story would cause more pain than relief. It was clear that no one had acted out of malice, but out of fear. The fear my grandmother carried until the end of her life seemed to have been passed on to the others, and they too chose silence. But silence, I realized, was more devastating than any truth. It had robbed all of us of the chance to know our true history, to understand where we came from. My mother, through her tears, apologized. "I never wanted to hide this from you. I just followed what I thought was right. But now I see that it was a mistake." I moved closer to her and held her hands. "I understand, Mom. I know you only wanted the best for me, for all of us. But we need to end this cycle of secrets. We need to honor Grandma's and Miguel's story." My mother nodded, and it was as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She took my grandmother's diary and began to leaf through it, as if trying, for the first time, to connect with the story that was also hers. My uncles began to speak, sharing childhood memories and stories that had previously been kept in fragments, without the complete connection. It was a moment of reconciliation, but also of confrontation, a confrontation with the past and with the choices we made out of fear. That meeting didn't bring all the answers, but it brought something essential: the acceptance that the past needed to be faced, not hidden. As I left my parents' house that night, I felt that, for the first time, our family had a chance to free itself from the secrets that bound us. And I was determined to keep seeking the connections that had been broken. After the conversation with my family, I felt a mix of relief and a deep sense of purpose. I knew that the weight of that secret wouldn't vanish overnight, but it was clear that facing the truth had begun a healing process. More than anything, I wanted to honor the love between my grandmother and Miguel and ensure that their story was no longer a hidden memory, but rather a living part of the legacy I would carry forward. One of the most important steps I decided to take was to visit my grandmother's grave. I brought the diary with me and spent a few hours sitting beside her, talking to her like I used to when I was a child. I read aloud some passages from the diary, the ones I knew she would want to hear again, and thanked her for finally trusting me with the truth. Tears rolled down my face, but they were tears of acceptance, no longer of pain or regret. "Grandma, I want you to know that, despite everything, I understand," I said softly. "I understand your choices. I understand your fear. And I'm here now trying to do what you couldn't. Thank you for giving me this chance." As I left the cemetery, I felt that a part of her was walking with me. She was no longer the distant figure shrouded in mysteries, but a courageous woman who, even within her limitations, did what she could to protect those she loved. In the days that followed, I began searching for more information about Miguel's family. Antonia had told me that he had siblings, and I managed to track down some records that led me to a nephew of his who still lived in the area. We arranged to meet, and I felt a mixture of nervousness and hope as I headed to the home of this man who, in a way, was part of my own story. When I arrived, I was greeted by an older man whose features, to my surprise, resembled mine. It was like looking at a reflection of the past, something that connected me directly to Miguel. He welcomed me warmly, and we spent the afternoon exchanging stories. He showed me old photos of Miguel and, for the first time, I saw more of the man my grandmother had loved so deeply. A man with a bright smile who seemed to carry his own light. He always talked about the woman he loved and the daughter he never met, Miguel's nephew said as he showed me one of the photos. I never saw him give up hope of finding them. That was who he was. Persistent, stubborn, but full of love. His words stayed with me. In that moment, I realized that my quest had not only been about uncovering the past, but also about connecting with roots that had been hidden for so long. Seeing those photos and hearing those stories was like filling a void I hadn't even known existed. I decided to keep in touch with that part of the family, to establish bonds that had been severed but could still be restored. Back in my hometown, I felt different, as if a new chapter of my life was beginning. A chapter no longer marked by secrets and silences, but by acceptance and connection. The truth about my grandmother and Miguel's story was now part of who I was, and I was determined to keep it alive, to share it with future generations so they could learn from the love and difficult choices made before us. As I looked out at the horizon that late afternoon, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and many questions remained unanswered, but what I had found was enough. The love my grandmother and Miguel shared had not been in vain. It had crossed time, secrets, and was now alive in me, and I knew I would carry this legacy forever.